Now let's look at some strategic decisions about the products that the firm makes. A keep or drop decision occurs when a firm has an unprofitable product and has to decide whether it makes sense to continue making it. If the product has a negative contribution margin, that means that the variable cost per unit is greater than the selling price per unit. In that case, it would make economic sense to stop making the product immediately, because the more units of this product the firm sells, the more money the firm would lose. On the other hand, if the product's contribution margin is positive, that means that the selling price is large enough to cover each unit's variable cost and contribute something to covering the firm's fixed overhead. In that case, the firm needs to consider what revenues and costs would be eliminated if they stop making the product, and also needs to consider whether any of the allocated fixed costs assigned to that product would go away. The easiest way to answer this keep or drop decision is to compare the operating profit or loss with and without this unprofitable product or division. Of course, subject to qualitative considerations. For example, would dropping the product have an effect on the sales of other products? Let's say that a firm makes refrigerators and stoves and dishwashers and trash compactors. The trash compactors may be unprofitable, but if dropping that line means that customers wouldn't want to buy the other products because they couldn't get a matched set, then maybe it makes sense to continue making the product. Another issue is whether the firm can think of some new profitable use for the factory space that used to be devoted to making the product that is now eliminated. In the last section, we talked about a firm called U-Develop that made photographic prints. Let's say that the firm actually has 3 departments: a print department, a camera department, and a frame department. Due to the development of digital cameras and better home printing, the print department finds that it is now operating at a loss. Should the print department be eliminated? Here are the divisional monthly results for the print department, the camera department, and the frames department. For each department, its sales revenue minus its variable costs gives its contribution margin, and then the allocated fixed costs are subtracted to give each department's operating profit or loss for the month. And we can see that the print department is operating at a loss. But we can also see that the print department has a positive contribution margin that goes to covering some of the firm's fixed costs. So we need to see whether any of those fixed costs would go away if the print department is closed. Obviously, If the firm decides to close the print department, the sales revenue would go away, and so would the variable costs, resulting in the firm losing the $2,000 of contribution margin that the department is currently contributing to covering the firm's fixed costs. But would any of those fixed costs be eliminated if the print department is closed? This is a very firm-specific issue. So somebody needs to tell us the answer to that question. In this particular case, there's going to be no change in rent if the print department is closed because all three departments operate out of one building. When it comes to salaries, this firm says that it can fire or reassign all of the employees who are used in the print department, so those costs can be eliminated. And the firm says that if the print department is closed, it won't have to advertise for the prints anymore, and the firm estimates that that will eliminate half of the allocated selling and administrative costs. Let's see whether UDevelop would be better off with or without the print department. This information on the performance of each department comes from the previous slide. To find out how the firm would do if it keeps the print department, we simply add the sales revenue from each department to get the total, and the variable costs, and the contribution margin, and the total fixed costs to find the firm's operating profit for the period if it keeps the print department. But what happens if the firm eliminates the print department? In that case, it would only have the sales revenue from cameras and frames, and it would only have the variable costs from cameras and frames. The sales revenue minus the variable costs gives the contribution margin. Or we could add the contribution margin that remains from the camera department and the frames department to find the total contribution margin if the print department is eliminated. Now let's think about the allocated fixed costs that would remain if the print department is eliminated. We were told that the rent wouldn't change, so the amount that was allocated to the print department now has to be covered by the remaining two departments. So we include it in the total rent if the print department is closed. On the other hand, the cost of the salaries allocated to the print department would be eliminated, so they're not included in that total if the print department is closed. For selling and administration, the firm estimated that half of those costs allocated to the print department would be eliminated. So the total selling and administrative without the print department would be the camera department's share, the frame department's share, and half of the print department's share. Altogether, we can take the total contribution margin without the print department, subtract out the various fixed costs to get the operating profit for the period if the print department is eliminated. If we want, we can check that answer by combining the operating profit from the camera division and the frame division, and then remembering to subtract out the additional cost of the rent and half of the selling and administrative costs that still exist but will no longer be covered by the print department. When we compare UDevelop's operating profit with the print division and without the print division, we find that the profit would actually decrease by $750 each month if the print division is eliminated. So, the firm would probably decide not to drop the print department. Of course, subject to qualitative considerations. When a firm is deciding whether to drop a product line, should it consider how dropping that product line would affect other product sales, or the costs that it would save by dropping the product line, or the revenues that it would lose by dropping that line, or all of these? That's right. These are all important factors when a firm is considering dropping a product line. A product mix decision has to do with the proportion of various products that the firm makes. This is especially important when there's a constraining resource that limits the amount of units that the firm can produce. The general rule for production is that the firm would prefer to make the products with the highest contribution margin per unit, subject to qualitative considerations like customer demand. However, a firm frequently has a constrained resource, that is, something in the firm that limits the firm's productive capacity. In that case, the firm would prefer to make the products with the highest contribution margin per unit of the constrained resource. In other words, the firm wants to get the most contribution margins out of this resource that limits its productivity. Of course, subject to qualitative considerations. Let's look at an example. Our firm, UDevelop, makes both metal frames and wooden frames in its frame department. We have some information about the selling price per unit for the metal frames, the variable cost, and the contribution margin, $30 per frame. And we have some information about the wood frames, the selling price per unit, the variable costs per unit, and the contribution margin, also $30 per unit. And we have information about the fixed costs. If the firm has unlimited machine hours, then the best strategy would be for the firm to make as many of each type of frame as it thinks it can sell, because the contribution margin per frame is the same. But what if the machine hours are limited? Now we have to consider how much contribution margin we can get per machine hour. For the metal frames, we take the $30 contribution margin per unit and divide by the half hour of machine time that it takes to make each frame. That means that the metal frames contribute $60 of contribution margin per machine hour because we can get 2 metal frames out of each machine hour. For the wooden frames, we have $30 of contribution margin per frame, but it takes an hour to make each frame. That means that the wooden frames only contribute $30 per machine hour. In that case, comparing the contribution margin per machine hour for the two products, the winning strategy would be to make as many metal frames as the firm thinks that it can sell, and then if there's any additional machine time left over, use that to make some wooden frames. Let's check our analysis. Suppose the firm has 200 machine hours available next month. If the 200 machine hours are used to make metal frames at half an hour per frame, that means that they could produce 400 frames. 400 frames times $30 of contribution margin per frame means that they could generate $12,000 of contribution margin. On the other hand, if they used the 200 machine hours to make wooden frames instead, they could only generate 200 frames because each wooden frame takes an hour to make. In that case, at $30 of contribution margin per frame, they would only generate $6,000 of contribution margin. Obviously, the exact number of frames that they make depends on customer demand, but it's clear that for this particular firm, making metal frames uses their limited number of machine hours more effectively than making wooden frames does. If a firm has a limiting resource, should it be focusing on the product line with the highest contribution margin per unit of product, or contribution margin per unit of the constraining factor, or profit per unit of the product, or contribution margin ratio? That's right. The key to increasing profitability when resources are limited is to focus on the contribution margin per unit of the constraining factor. This is the end of this section. In the next section, we'll look at some more short-term strategic decisions.